Hi, I'm Rachel Baumberger from Eerdmans Publishing. I'm here with Oliver Crisp, who is the author of Jonathan Edwards Among the Theologians. Welcome, Oliver.
Thank you. Very nice to be here.
It's great to have you. So, diving right in, I want to start with the subject of your book, Jonathan Edwards, whom I must admit, until somewhat recently, I knew him mostly as this fire and brimstone preacher who came up with this wonderful sermon, awful, wonderful sermon, Sinners in the Hands of the Angry God.
Yeah.
But there is so much more to him than that. What is Edwards all about?
That is a really good question. I think many people have a perception of Edwards, which is a kind of popular Edwards. It's Edwards of the one sermon, or maybe more than one sermon, several sermons. But it's definitely Edwards the preacher and Edwards the kind of New England Puritan, which of course is part of who he is. But there is a lot more to Edwards than merely the fire and brimstone, I should say, preacher that one often reads about in school textbooks. He was a minister, and that was how he made his living, as it were. That was his vocation. But he also was a tutor for a while at the Yale College, as it was then, and he ended up as president of what is now Princeton University. So he had a number of different vocations. He also spent some time on what was then the frontier as a missionary to the Native Americans. So he had a lot of different ways in which the jobs that he did took him in different directions. But in addition to that, his writings are actually much richer, deeper, fuller, and broader than many people think. So in addition to the sermons that he was churning out week on week, he spent literally 13 hours a day in his study every day, working hard through scripture and through philosophy and theology, pouring out notebook after notebook and treatises on theology and philosophy, including some really significant works like his work on freedom of the will, religious affections, his work on original sin, and his two dissertations on true virtue and on the end of creation. So there's a whole sort of range of things that Edwards was involved with, but much of it, like an iceberg, is below the surface of what is seen publicly. And so part of what I'm trying to do in this book is get us to dive down and have a look at what's below the surface. And it turns out that what's below the surface is, I think, extremely exciting and interesting.
Yeah, one of the wonderful things about this book is that you look not as at Edwards the historical figure, but as Edwards the theologian. You take him seriously as a theologian, and you put him in conversation with a number of really intriguing dialogue partners.
Yeah.
Who are some of those people? Yeah,
I think Edwards, part of what makes Edwards so interesting is that he takes ideas that you think seem so commonplace in theology, and he often turns them on their head, or at least turns them around so that you see a rather different angle on things that you thought were clear and established truths. And it seems to me that's a mark of a great thinker. So one thing I want to do was to try and bring those ideas that Edwards has into conversation with other great thinkers in the Christian tradition to see, what happens when you bring those together. Do they spark off one another? Are there interesting ways in which you have a kind of dialectic or some kind of distinction between what they're saying? So one of the chapters, for example, deals with what Edwards has to say about who God is in relation to someone like St. Anselm of Canterbury, who's one of the great medieval theologians who thinks about the doctrine of God with some care. And it turns out that although they share together a kind of theological heritage that's derived from St. Augustine, they take that in different ways. And surprisingly, perhaps, it turns out that of the two, Edwards is perhaps the more speculative theologian rather than the great medieval. It's the Enlightenment thinker who goes in slightly different directions. And again, it seemed like it would be interesting to compare what Edwards says on the doctrine of creation with what Jacob Arminius says on the doctrine of creation. Now, usually Arminius and Edwards are sort of thought of as polar opposites. You've got Edwards, who's the bastion of Reformed orthodoxy, and Arminius, who's kind of subverting that and taking the Reformed tradition in a different direction, and so on. But actually, when you compare what they say on the doctrine of creation, once again, it turns out that Edwards has a very creative and interesting account of creation, but also it's an account of creation that pushes what he thinks towards the margins of orthodoxy vis-a-vis the larger Christian tradition. Whereas it's in many ways Arminius whose doctrine of creation seemed to be much more part of the mainstream Christian tradition. And then I thought it would also be interesting to compare what Edwards says on the doctrine of the atonement, on Christ's work, with one of his immediate disciples, called Bellamy, who was responsible, along with one or two other people like Hopkins and Jonathan Edwards' son, for the development of what became known as the New Divinity and then subsequently the New England Theology, which was a kind of theological school that developed out of Edwards' work in the later 18th century and into the 19th century. And one interesting discussion there is that this New England theology ended up with a view of the atonement which is seems to be at odds with much of the rest of the Reformed tradition. An account that's sometimes called the moral government view, according to which Christ is not a penal substitute, as many Reformed theologians thought, but a kind of penal example instead. And so one question is, how is it that you get this developing in the New England theology? It's supposed to be the disciples of Jonathan Edwards, when Edwards seems to want to hold on to penal substitution. So here's an interesting opportunity to think about how in the Reformed tradition there might be a diversity of views on a particularly important topic, the doctrine of the atonement, and how it is that Edwards ended up basically endorsing a view that he didn't hold himself, but he thought was part of a family of views that were acceptable within the tradition. So that's one of the key themes in the book, to try and bring Edwards into conversation with other great thinkers in the tradition.
And it sounds like it was a very fruitful exercise in discovering who Edwards was. And I think another thing about your work on Edwards that would perhaps come as a surprise to some people is that although he is very much within the Reformed tradition, which is perhaps one reason he's so popular, he's also very innovative.
Yeah.
What innovations did he bring out?
Wow. Well, Edwards has become a kind of poster boy for the kind of young, restless and reformed, the neo-Calvinists. Here's the T-shirt. There's much that's good about that as far as I'm concerned. It gets people reading Edwards, and I think Edwards is a great thinker and can be very helpful. He's an unusual thinker in that he's not just sort of sitting in his study, but he's preaching in the pulpit, and he's involved with the First Great Awakening. So there are ways in which Edwards unusually is read both by Harvard historians and by Pentecostal pastors in South America. And there aren't hundreds of theologians who can say that.
No.
But he is also a man who has some unusual ideas, as you say. So here's a few of those unusual ideas, some of which are explored in the book. Many people in the Reformed tradition are what we would call Christian theists. In other words, they think there is a God, of course, and that God creates a world, but those two things are distinct. God creates and then sustains the world, but the world is his creation, it's something different from God, and God freely creates the world. These sorts of ideas are sort of commonplace in the Christian tradition and part and parcel of Reformed theology. Edwards takes that and does some rather unusual things with it. First of all, he's an idealist, so he thinks that God is a kind of supermind, as it were, and God is really the only thing that truly exists, and we only exist in some kind of liminal or shadowy state as minds that exist within the divine mind, and the ideas that we have of the world around us are ideas that are communications from God himself. So Edwards is what's called an idealist. He thinks that the world around us is literally a world just composed of minds and their ideas. Our experience of the world around us is simply an experience of ideas that are communicated to us by God. There's no material world, although it seems to us that there are physical objects. There's actually not material things in space. So that's strange enough, although there have been some Christians willing to take that view other than Edwards. But then he goes on to say that the created order itself is somehow contained within God as part of these communications out of God. And that seems to drive him in the direction of what's sometimes called panentheism or all-in-Godism. And panentheism is roughly the idea that somehow the world is contained within God. It's not like the theist thinks something distinct from God, where you've got God here and the world there, but somehow the world is contained within the divine life itself. Now that is an idea that's very popular today in broader theological circles, but is not usually associated with people who are sort of strict Calvinists, if you like.
No,
so
you're quite right, it's not.
It's pretty unusual to find someone who is, canonically a strict Calvinist, nevertheless taking this rather unusual view. And so some of those ideas are ideas I'm trying to explore in the book and say, there are these unusual aspects to Edwards' thought, but nevertheless unusual in a way that's creative and suggestive and I hope helpful as we think about these things in the 21st century.
Sounds like we probably have a lot to learn from Edwards, and following him can be a very fascinating path.
I think so. Yeah, I think he is one of these figures who, even if you don't end up agreeing with him on every point, and some things that he does say seem a little crazy sometimes, nevertheless, because he's got such a fine mind, he is someone who's able to clarify the issues and take the clarity to a new level. And that means it's helpful to the rest of us as we come to analyze and think about some of these topics, because here we've got someone who's already thought about them in such great depth and detail that we're able to take what he's thought about as a kind of foundational basis for thinking theologically ourselves. So in a sense, I think Edwards is one of those theological giants, to mix my metaphors. He's a theological giant on whose shoulders we can stand, and hopefully because we're standing on his shoulders, we can see a little bit further than perhaps Edwards himself did.
Well, let's hope so. Now, just as by way of closing, what do you think it is about Edwards that has us still reading and learning about and wearing T-shirts of today?
Yeah. Well, I think, I have already said that Edwards has this great range.
Indeed.
There are many Christian theologians whose work is really restricted to a kind of small elite of those people who have the wherewithal to sort of indulge themselves in thinking about the sorts of things that those theologians themselves think about. Edwards is unusual, I think, in that he has this ability to speak in very different contexts, in sermons through to weighty treatises and lots of things in between, to a range of people. And so he has a light touch, or a lighter touch anyway, for an 18th century thinker. He has a lighter touch, and he's got these other things that he says, these other bigger books that are also worth engaging. And I think that means that he is accessible to a much wider range of people. There is the popular Edwards that most people are conversant with. There's the scholarly Edwards that fewer people are conversant with. Really what I'm trying to do here is bring the scholarly Edwards into the limelight a little bit more in the hope that might commend this larger part of Edwards's thinking that perhaps we are not so familiar with to a broader audience, so that people can be excited as much about that as they are about the sort of popular Edwards that they read about when they're reading the sermons of Edwards and thinking about the sorts of things that electrify a lot of Christians today. Things about, like Edwards's view about how we should be delighting in God and how God's happiness is what we should be seeking to involve ourselves and our lives in. Those sorts of things, which are a kind of God intoxication, if you like, that Edwards brings to the table. And I think that can be a sort of way of thinking about Christian theology that is really quite electrifying.
Edwards, the electrifying, periwigged New England parson. Thank you for that phrase.
Yeah, my pleasure.
Then thank you, Oliver, for being with us.
Thank you very much.
The book again is Jonathan Edwards Among the Theologians.